Great, thanks everyone for being here. So Jason, I wanted to start with you to sort of kick off this conversation here because I know that SBA just went through creating their strategic plan, a new strategic plan, and that obviously has a lot to do with setting new performance goals. So can you talk a little bit broadly about the process of how you developed those, how you fine-tuned them, any challenges that came up as you were setting those, and just sort of how those all came together?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having us here. I appreciate it. It's really important to talk about performance management within the federal government. And first, I want to mention if folks are interested in agency strategic plans, they're available on performance.gov right now. All agencies did release them on February 12th, and that's really important. So going back to Eric's point about the process, we really started out about a year ago to outline where we wanted to be as an organization, as the SBA. And I would really say it was a collaborative process. We engaged with stakeholders, we engaged with the Office of Management and Budget, we engaged with Congress. First, however, we did start off working with Administrator McMahon, outlining her vision for the agency and really identifying what those core visions are, which I really think translates nicely to this event. And the key points she wanted to make in the strategic plan were, how are we as an organization? Are we effective, right? Are we doing what we need to be doing? Are we efficient? Are we using our resources wisely? Are we accountable? And are we involving employees? And I think that those key points are really important and really helped guide the strategic planning process. So we met with senior leadership. We helped develop those key goals, strategies, and activities that centered around our programs and ensure that we were meeting those core visions for the SBA. I think it was a fairly smooth process. I don't think there were any major hiccups along the way. We really had a lot of engagement throughout the process. I think there was a lot of communication with employees, and I think that was really a key part of the process, that we did have that kind of bottom-up approach too, where we did engage staff. Throughout the cycle, we sent out newsletters to staff. We asked for public comment. We asked for employee feedback on the strategic plan, and that was really important to help us get to where we wanted to be as an organization. So again, if you're interested in looking at those strategic plans, go to performance.gov. They're there. We're really proud of ours, and I think that the strategic plan will guide our agency for this administration.
And then once that sort of came together, I know you said you involved the employees, took a sort of bottom-up approach, but once those were configured and put into the plan, how were they then communicated out to say this is sort of what we came up with?
Absolutely. So most recently we had the administrator do a video, and she put together a video of here's what our strategic plan is, communicated that out to staff along with some of the other key points she wanted to mention to them. Again, throughout throughout the strategic planning process, it really was kind of an effort to engage employees throughout the process and to ensure that they understood kind of how it flowed down. We've had various working groups communicating out program strategies out to the field offices, setting new priority goals, which I'll mention a little bit later, and just, again, ensuring kind of a consistent process throughout, whether that be kind of the newsletters, videos, town hall sessions.
Great, and do you have just a quick example? We don't want to get too far into the weeds of SBA, of something that sort of bubbled up from employees and you all said, okay, yeah, this is something that we need to address.
I think that there are a few areas. One I would mention is kind of how we're engaging the field staff and how we're kind of communicating that out. Oftentimes when we're developing a strategic plan, we work with program managers within headquarters, but there are a lot of key activities and efforts that happen within the field. At the SBA, we have, for example, our lender relations specialists who are helping to support lenders and small businesses access capital. And we wanted to ensure that their activities were represented in the strategic plan. So that was, I think, an important consideration that we incorporated from the field into our strategic planning process.
Great. Andrew, the partnership helps put together the best places to work rankings every year based on the Viewpoint survey. and I know that you work with federal executives directly, helping coach them, et cetera. So sort of broadly, what are you seeing from the data as far as how goals are being communicated and how much are employees engaging with those goals and becoming familiarized with them? And then sort of on a more focused perspective, what are you seeing sort of on a day-to-day basis from the executives that you work with to sort of improve on that, and what's working and what's not working when you're in the field?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Andrew Marshall with the partnership. Again, like Jason said, thanks for having us. If you don't know who we are, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and our mission is to make government more effective. So we are in your corner. And we do put out the best places to work rankings, which means you either love us or hate us, but don't shoot the messenger. I did talk to someone from NASA earlier this morning, and they love us. But we love them
every year, right?
for managing effectively. So what we're seeing, one thing that we've seen since the rankings were launched now about 16 years ago, is that leadership is the #1 driver for employee engagement and satisfaction. And that's been a consistent beat that we've seen as we've crunched the numbers year after year. And if you look at the leadership index, and you look at places where it really matters, senior leaders really matter. And that's actually not as high as it could be right now. I think we're in the 40s of 100 points. Supervisors is higher. It's closer to 65 out of 100. And another factor, I think, another data point that matters here is performance-based rewards and advancement. How fair are people in their awards, in their promotions, in their recognition? How do they notice and pay attention to high performance and innovation? That's also fairly low, around 45 points. And so that is fairly well backed up with my experience as an executive coach and facilitator in working with leaders across government and across agencies. You do see sometimes a disconnect. So thinking about the strategic plan, I think, to Jason's point, I'll sometimes recommend a leader go to performance.gov with their employee and see if they can connect the dots. How is the work that the employee is doing connecting back to the overarching strategic goal or the goal? I was joking, I think, with Maria this morning. One of NASA's strategic goals is to explore whether or not we have life on Mars. That's pretty exciting. Could you go find an employee in NASA to see if there is, in fact, a connection to their work and that ambitious strategic goal? So I think making the connection is important, and over-communicating these goals, ensuring that there can be no possibility of confusion. I'm working with an executive right now who, as I've been interviewing her direct reports, doing a 360, they've said a couple of things. One, they're not sure what they should be focusing on. They don't really know where to put their attention. And two, they're not sure she knows where she's focusing. Now that's a challenge. That doesn't inspire confidence in the leader, and it doesn't inspire purpose for the employee. Now when talking with her, she does believe that she knows what she's focusing on and what they should be. What's the disconnect? It's communication. She has not told them in clear enough terms, enough times, this is what we are focusing on, this is what I am focusing on, this is where we're trying to get to, and this is how you can be part of that. So I think communication is a big piece.
So it's important to sort of communicate out the broad goals for the agency, but then for the manager to then go to each of their reports and say, this is how you fit into that picture, this is what you're doing to contribute to that goal.
That's right. Yeah, and I think it gets back to a lot of good research on leadership development. You may be familiar with Dan Pink, his book Drive, where he talks about autonomy, purpose, and mastery, some of the areas that will actually tap into an individual's intrinsic motivation. Again, awards and recognition is great, extrinsic motivators are great, and there are some risks associated with those. If you can tap into intrinsic motivation, you're going to be able to light a fire inside the employee that you can't get otherwise. And I think, to your point, this is purpose. If they are clear on how they're helping achieve an agency mission or government's overall mission, that's going to ignite the intrinsic motivation, and they're going to perform more effectively. You may have to make that connection for them, though. And often I've seen that people will join public service with that flame really well lit and kindled, and it can die down over the years. And so as a manager or a leader, as an executive, you might need to reignite that. Remind them why they came, remind them what you're doing, remind them how this transcends partisan politics and it's about service to the public.
Great. Jason, you mentioned that you were, as part of the strategic plans, SBA, and all agencies are reissuing their agency priority goals, first time in the new administration. And the full sort of release of those, I think, is coming out this month. It's part of the President's management agenda. So can you talk about how you went the process of creating the new agency priority goals, how that fits into the management agenda that we're going to see in the next few weeks, how do you sort of try to connect that, weave that together, and sort of the process of working through all of that as during the transition, period.
Absolutely. Well, the agency priority goals are currently available with the strategic plans. What's going to be coming out soon is the cross-agency priority goals as relates to the President's management agenda. And I'll talk about a couple of them, and they really do go back to those core values that Administrator McMahon outlined for effective and efficient. One of the priority goals that we set up, we worked with our capital programs, again, where one of the major aspects of the SBA is we help provide loans to small businesses to access capital. So one of the priority goals we focused on was providing greater outreach to disadvantaged, socially and economically disadvantaged urban and rural communities. And so we set up a priority goal where, again, connecting it back to the field, back to the lender relations specialist. So it's, again, a top-down. So we see, okay, our high-level goal is ensuring access to capital, but then our priority goal is helping to kind of push out those loans to these communities. And so we've set up that process. Again, it speaks to that core value of making sure we're effective, we're really having the impact we want to have, and being efficient. Another priority goal that we've set up too is related to disaster assistance. And a lot of folks don't know that the SBA helps and partners with FEMA after a major disaster. And over this past fall with the major hurricanes that impacted the South and Caribbean, we put in place a new effort to help modernize some of our IT systems so that we're actually helping process loan applications faster. We're actually going to double the loan application rate for loan specialists through this new system. And so that really speaks to some of the things you'll be seeing in the President's management agenda, connecting back to IT modernization, ensuring an effective workforce. And both these examples do speak to obviously kind of the IT modernization, but also retraining staff, refocusing on how we're going to be providing support so that the staff understand what their priorities are and ensuring that's incorporated into their performance plans.
And as you put those goals out there, how important is it to set metrics that correspond with them? And what's the sort of the process of creating those metrics so that you're striving to really accomplish something, but you don't want to make it so too unrealistic?
And metrics are a challenge. I think it's always difficult. And Andrew and I were talking earlier about target setting, and it is a challenge understanding what should your target be, particularly if it's a new goal or a new area where you haven't explored before. And so sometimes it is a little bit more of an art than a science. One thing I do want to mention, though, that's really important is having the accountability mechanisms in place, and I think that's really important for goal setting. One of the things we do at the Small Business Administration is we have quarterly deep dive performance reviews that we set up with senior leadership. And kind of going back to Andrew's point about engaging senior leadership from the start, obviously setting the goals, but having those regular discussions with them to say, okay, what's the progress of this? We can go back, determine where should we be, benchmark other program offices, provide insights from support offices, right? At the quarterly deep dive sessions, we have our chief financial officer who serves as our performance improvement officer. We have our Chico there. We have our chief information officer. So it's really an engaged process. So, so part of it is establishing the metrics and targets up front, which again is a little bit challenging, but I think more important is having those accountability mechanisms in place to ensure that we are making progress and that we're on track. And if we are, exceeding our goals, then maybe we need to adjust them later on.
Andrew, when you, what do you tell executives as they're sort of dealing with this process of coming up or having to react to new goals as they get into a new administration? I remember we reported during the transition in 2016 that many senior executives in government had never been through this process before as senior executives. So is that something that you hear concern about? How, what sort of tips do you have for employees as they work through this process of maybe shifting the priority or communicating it in a different way? Is that something that you deal with at all?
Yeah, I think it's true that many executives are in for their first time with this new administration. They haven't been through a transition before, and we wish more executives would stay longer. There are certainly those who haven't, and there's also plenty of people who have moved into the executive ranks during this transition, but they've seen transitions before, and they've been around long enough to know that agendas are going to change, priorities are going to change, goals are going to change, and the mission can be a constant. And I think noting both of those pieces is important, from the executive to the management, to the workforce, that our agenda may shift and our priorities may shift, and here is how they are shifting, and here is our steady drumbeat. Here is the constant of our mission at our agency. I think clarifying those two pieces is important, and improving working relationships among career and political teams is important as well. Where there is cohesion there, you can get a lot done, and where there is disconnect, I've seen places even recently where it feels like they're working in separate organizations in a way, and that's not going to be very productive. One thing I was thinking about with measurement, too, based on what Jason said, one cabinet secretary in the previous administration, he asked all employees to identify one way that they were contributing to the overall strategic goals. And that was part of their performance plan, for every employee to think about one way that they're contributing to the overarching effort. And that's a very simple request that can have a lot of power and move the needle for an agency. So one example of accountability being, yes, with leadership, but also with employees.
So I'm thinking about the first point that you were making. So it might benefit the political leadership of an agency to say, yes, we are shifting a little bit our focus, but this is how it still fits into the larger picture of what we do here and what we have been doing for throughout any administration.
Yeah, I think so. And seeking feedback along the way, to check in regularly to say, how are we doing against these milestones? And also to say, what would you recommend? To be open to both offering and receiving feedback frequently, I think is a critical piece, both from a performance management and a goal perspective, as well as from a personnel and interpersonal perspective. This may be derailing us just slightly, but I was in a retreat last year at one point, and a direct report gave her supervisor, who was an executive, feedback that she'd been holding on to for about a decade. And if finally, for whatever reason, and I don't know why I happened to be there, it came out. And so that's another, I think, piece around all of this is trust. Yes, we can look at the mechanisms and the procedures and the good technical practices. A lot of this comes down to, what's your relationship like with the folks that you're leading? And do they trust you, and do you trust them? You can get a lot done if you've got that going on. If you're holding on to something for a decade, it's going to be hard to actually get productive work done.
Jason, you talked about accountability and going back to the managers and making sure that they're living up to their end of the bargain. And Andrew's been talking about communicating supervisor to employee more frequently. Is that something that you've seen at SBA? Is it something that you're focusing on at all to try to make that dialogue happen more frequently?
Absolutely. And one really good example of that, we have a monthly executive performance dashboard that we release, which we send to all senior leaders, and oftentimes they send that out to their program managers and send that out to their employees, so they know where are we in terms of the organization, where are they in terms of their goals and measures, and oftentimes we do break it out by the regional offices. So we can actually use data to inform that decision making to say, okay, where are we in terms of this goal? Are we 50% there? Are we 20% there? And that really supports the transparency aspect of it, as well as accountability, because if you know that you're in a particular region that might be a little bit behind another region, okay, well, I'm going to make the effort to go a little bit further and to ensure that I'm making that progress.
A little healthy competition.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm happy to turn it over to questions if anybody in the audience has anything.
Sure. So
Maybe can you repeat the
yeah.
question?
So the question is related to our monthly executive performance dashboard and some of the metrics that we use in that. So one example that I would mention, kind of going back to the agency priority goal for the socially and economically disadvantaged communities. So we've actually put together 4 different metrics. One is related to kind of the national picture, breaking out the rural versus the urban communities to show the trend across time. We've also have another breakout of that data looking at it by region. So we see across our 10 regional offices, where are we in terms of the total goal. And then we also break out some other contextual indicators too, showing loan volume, right? If we show the total loan volume, what does that look like in comparison to that particular goal? For some of our other metrics, we have a contracting goal. The federal government sets a 23% goal for small businesses, and so for that one, we break that out by each federal agency where the numbers are. We look at it across time. So for each of our strategic goals and strategic objectives, we do have a slide for each program office, and then the program office identifies their core metrics. And then they report that data out to us monthly, we have a team of performance analysts that help put together that dashboard, and then we send that out to the senior leadership, who then distributes it to the program managers.
Andrew, I was covering a Senate hearing recently, and OPM was testifying, and they were sort of all pressing him to say, what laws do we need to change, what rules do we need to change to help hire more quickly, and that's obviously their performance goal, average time to hire, bring that down. And he said, look, what we really need are more technology and tools. He was talking, I think, to some degree about having dashboards that help supervisors look at these metrics in real time. Is this something that you're seeing being adopted on a more widespread basis around government?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great example, and I love that that's so clear. There's no
Right.
confusion about what you're trying to accomplish, where you're at, and that it's getting out, disseminated from leadership to the workforce. You're seeing more dashboards, more mechanisms for accountability and clarity. And I also have to say, we sometimes want the technology or the advancement to solve some of the human problems that we may have. A lot of this comes back to how we're leading. And you could talk about policy all day long. Can we fire more easily? Can we hire more quickly? Can we reward pay for performance and all of this? When really, I think it comes down to a lot of effective management. A lot of common sense that's just not common behavior. And so our managers inspiring trust. I was with a group where they would not write on a Post-it because they were worried that someone would identify their handwriting on the Post-it. And they would only talk with me in an elevator or outside the office. When there's that little trust, and I'm telling a lot of bad stories. There are a lot of good ones too. But when there's that little trust, any number of great dashboards or technical tools, it's not going to answer your problem. Are you listening? Are you offering feedback? Are you staying curious about your employees? Are you checking in and asking them where they are, or asking them what they want to accomplish, and seeing, is there alignment to what they hope to accomplish and what you hope to accomplish? So I do think it does come back to a lot of the simple common behaviors of good leadership that would resolve a lot of our challenges and pave a path for, I think, some of these mechanisms and policies to be even more effective should they be implemented.
Jason, Andrew mentioned pay for performance. I know that was floated in the president's budget. Is that something that you all at SBA are thinking about, working toward, things would be helpful, or is it more of a cross that bridge when you get to it, since it's obviously going to require some sort of change, legislative change?
I think we probably wait and see kind of what happens in terms of legislation. And again, we do have processes in place where we are, we have a performance-based system. And so I think it's always exciting and great to look at new ways of doing things and being innovative. And so I'm sure it's something we could look into.
Any other questions in the audience? Go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to probably come from a very unpopular standpoint, but I work with unions, right? And so, as we all know, unions don't employ employees. We don't hire, right? But we represent the people who you hire. And so, one of the challenges that, like, my skin cringes when I hear this pay for performance, because you all were speaking about the challenges with management and how do I couch this? Okay, so managers maybe not even having the tools or doing the communication piece, or even having been provided with the foundation being laid there, because there could be so many different opportunities for folks to, when different administrations come in and go, or people being detailed to different places. So when you're talking about pay for performance, the person who is actually rating that performance, is that the best person to actually be gauging that work? Because maybe they didn't even know how that functions in that level. So what are some, things that employees can look to have to, so that when they do go into this pay for performance setup, that they're actually will be successful in it, instead of being able to be moved out of the door because they don't feel like they're being performed right.
One comment.
Loaded, right?
Yeah, well, see what I can do with that. I'll let Jason actually answer it. But one thing to think about is just being real with them in your feedback. At the performance reviews and other times, being clear that if they are at a meets, they are at a meets. If they are at an exceeds, they are at an exceeds. And if they're at a needs improvement, they're down there. And it's really, you've probably heard of the 20-60-20 model, where you've got the high performers on the outlier side on one side, low performers on the other side, and a lot of people there in that 60 range. We in government often push everybody up into that exceeds, into that 4 or 5 category, which should be moving the whole bar and isn't necessarily. I've worked with teams where we've identified what does it mean to meet, what does it mean to exceed, what does it mean to need improvement, and use that as a guide in your conversations and be clear, have it be measurable so that you can have that conversation and partner with the union in those kinds of performance conversations, particularly when there's a challenge to it. So those would be some of my thoughts, is to be very clear about what these expectations actually mean so that when they see them, there isn't a big surprise and there can't be a major argument or even grievance because it's clear where they are.
I would just say communication's key. I think that's really important, and that I think that's really a key theme on what Andrew said, to ensure that everybody understands what the goals are, and that you have clear measurements, and then involving stakeholders to set those goals.
Jason, do you ever come across, I mean, I'm sure this must happen where you're setting these new goals or metrics and you hear feedback after they're communicated out from a supervisor who sort of feels slighted that their priority wasn't pushed far enough, or now they're doing something that's a little different than they had to, or the metric that is being asked of them is not realistic. How do you handle that sort of pushback, and what do you do to sort of assuage those concerns?
Well, I would say there's always a dialogue before any metric is set up. I think that's really important. It's not our office coming and saying, here's your metric, here's what you need to do. It's always a conversation about what are your priorities, what do you want to do, and how can we help you achieve those goals, right? So we're not the ones that are saying, okay, here's everything you must do by X date. It's really a conversation, a dialogue, so we don't have a conversation like that down the road where folks feel slighted because they don't have the right metrics in place. And even after that dialogue, I mean, sometimes it is difficult, again, to determine what the right metric is, because it is trying to find what data supports that goal. And so oftentimes it is an iterative process, so you do come back to the drawing board after a year and say, okay, this metric really didn't tell us what we needed to do. But we have the conversation, right? And we communicate what our priorities are and then set the goals.
Does anybody else have any questions? I think we have one over here.
Thank you. Obviously, you're taking a very modern approach to performance management. I was just curious, within the SBA and within other federal agencies, what tools, resources, and methodologies do you find yourselves reliant on? And I'm particularly interested in the methodologies.
That's a really good question. I think that part of it's keeping things simple. Even with some of the data collection, I mean, we try to establish a lot of our performance metrics in spreadsheets, and really haven't spent a whole lot of money on kind of new enhanced dashboards, right? I think keeping it simple is really important. And the same thing for the methodology too. I think we can come up with very complex metrics, but if it's hard to communicate what that metric is, then you're not going to get buy-in from senior leadership or employees. And it's important to be able to have metrics in place that are easily understood, where you can easily collect information and data to support those conversations. Some metrics are extremely complex, and we do work around them. I would say at the SBA we have about 100 different performance metrics that we're tracking on an annual basis.
And I'd just say one more plug for performance.gov, where you can see people's performance goals and strategic plans and get a sense for how are they communicating them, what are they, maybe get into methodology a little bit, but so many examples there for you to look at.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning. Andrew, I think this one is for you. What is your recommendation when it comes to employees who have been there for decades at the top of their career ladder? How do you keep them engaged? How do you measure their performance? I mean, is it just about training? Where do they want to go next? Just keeping them fresh? I mean, as a supervisor, that's very difficult to do. Every year you go through this and you're talking to someone who's just 14, 15 and saying, okay, our mission is to find life on Mars. How do you, besides, of course, focusing on the mission and, we're doing amazing work, what is your recommendation for supervisors?
And after people have spent a lot of their careers in one place, things can begin to, they aren't going to be quite as excited about the extrinsic motivators. They're probably in a place where their pay is satisfactory, they're used to that, and other kinds of perks may not have the same resonance as they might with a newer employee. And so I think Having conversations, I already mentioned this, but focusing on what's going to drive them internally. How can you give them more space, more autonomy? What skills are they still hoping to develop? And identifying those, and how might those align with your mission goals? And then reminding them of what you are about at the bigger picture. So that autonomy, purpose, mastery, I think really comes in handy for people who are seasoned and still have more to offer. And I think providing them opportunities to mentor, again, if that's something that they're interested in, don't let the institutional knowledge leave with them. Help them train and guide and support younger staff at various levels so that succession planning isn't quite as difficult, doesn't leave the gaping hole when they do, in fact, leave. Those would be some ways that I think you could potentially engage folks who have been one place for a very long time. I think a lot of coaching questions, a lot of open-ended, what's driving you? What would success look like this year? What do you want to accomplish? What might get in your way? What keeps you here? What will continue to keep you here? I think those are the kinds of conversations that work well at that level.
I think we have time for one more question. I saw you over here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any recommendations or examples for how you may have used enterprise risk management to assist in performance management?
Sure. I would say at the SBA, we've integrated ERM, enterprise risk management, into our strategic planning process. That was really important. From the start of the strategic planning process last February, we worked with our enterprise risk manager to lay out a plan. And we also worked with our human capital planning staff as we were developing our human capital operating plan. So within our strategic planning team, ensuring that all key stakeholders were part of that process so that when we were developing those goals and objectives, we got feedback from the ERM team, and you know, they thought about, okay, well, how are the goals and metrics going to be achieved, and what are the risks associated with that if you don't achieve it, and other risks too. And they've used that to develop, inform the risk management conversations with senior leadership as well. So it's ensuring that they're part of that process.
I think you had one more question. We might be able to squeeze it in real quick.
Thank you. This one is for Jason, and this might be a little bit selfish, but I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about organizations like SBA that deal with a lot of employees with high movement or turnover, some of the challenges of performance management when you have a lot of people detailing or doing higher surges and things like that.
Again, I think it goes back to communication, understanding what your priorities are, right? If you have someone who's managing a project or managing a high-level goal, and having someone who can fill into that position if someone does go into detail, and ensuring you have kind of that backup system in place, and that you're, again, communicating what the expectations are, and supporting kind of the overarching mission of the organization. I think that's really important.
All right, great. Well, that's just about all of our time. Thank you, Jason and Andrew, for being here. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks all.